Our ship, the Starseeker, was no longer a vessel. It had become a pressurized steel coffin, drifting in the crushing silence of Sector 4. A gravitational anomaly had wrung our engines dry like a wet rag. Oxygen levels sat at 4%. My crew, some of the finest scientific minds in the galaxy, were slumped on the floor, counting their final shallow breaths. I had sent a distress signal to the Galactic Council. Their response had arrived 10 minutes ago, and it was cold, logical, and final. Commander Varax, the nearest rescue vessel is 4 light years from your position. Your hull will collapse in 6 minutes. According to our mathematics, your probability of survival is 0%. We are archiving your data. Farewell. That was the law of the galaxy. Mathematics was God. If the calculation said you were dying, the universe considered you already dead. I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold. Sir, look at the monitor. My navigator croaked, his voice thick with disbelief. I forced my eyes open. A strange blip had appeared on the long-range scanners. It wasn't the sleek, shimmering hull of a council ship. It was a bulky, scarred, and ugly hunk of metal, painted a dull white with a bold red cross on its side. Who is that? I whispered. The signal. They are Terrans, Sir Humans. Signal them to turn back. I shouted, a surge of panic hitting my chest. Don't they see the anomaly? They'll be pulled in too. They're throwing their lives away. A voice crackled over the radio. It was hauntingly calm, almost casual. Starseeker, this is the human medical frigate Nightingale. We heard your ping. Just hang tight, we're coming in hot. Nightingale, listen to me. I replied, leaning into the console. The council has already run the numbers. Our survival rate is 0. Is your equipment malfunctioning? You are flying into a graveyard. There was a brief moment of silence. Then, the human voice returned, this time with a hint of a dry chuckle. Commander, we've been cheating on our math tests since primary school. We don't care about your numbers. We have an old rule back home. No one gets left behind. Do you have the tea ready, or should we bring our own? The next second, the mad human ship slammed into ours with such force, I thought we would disintegrate. But we didn't. They had engaged high-tensile magnetic clamps. They weren't just docking. They were grabbing us. Their engines began to scream, their hull groaning under the pressure of the gravitational pull. But they didn't let go. They were fist-fighting death itself for a crew of aliens they didn't even know. These people weren't brave. They were insane. And I realized then that this insanity was exactly what they called humanity. The airlock didn't just open. It was practically torn apart. Through the haze of freezing carbon dioxide and failing emergency lights, 3 figures stormed onto our bridge. They weren't wearing the sleek, lightweight environmental suits of the Council. These were heavy-duty void suits, thick, scarred, and looking more like armored tanks than medical gear. One of them, with the word Miller stenciled across his chest plate, looked at the flickering oxygen gauge on the wall and swore. Atmosphere's shot, Miller's voice boomed through the external speakers. Sarah, get the O2 canisters cracking. Jackson, start the triage. Move. I watched, paralyzed, as the one called Sarah slammed a device into the floor. It hissed violently, pumping pure, life-giving oxygen into the room. It was a brute force atmospheric reset, a move so dangerous it could cause a fire. But the humans didn't seem to care about the risk of fire when we were already suffocating. You shouldn't be here, I managed to wheeze as Miller knelt beside me. The anomaly. Your ship's hull is at 110% stress capacity. It's going to snap. Yeah, she's screaming a bit, Miller said, his hands moving with surgical precision as he attached a portable breather to my face. But the Nightingale is made of spite and recycled soda cans. She holed. Across the room, The medic named Jackson was hovering over my navigator, who had stopped breathing. In any other corner of the galaxy, the navigator would be declared lost resource. But Jackson was slamming his fists into the navigator's chest in a rhythmic, violent motion. "What are you doing?" I gasped. "You're breaking his exoskeleton." "I'm keeping his heartbeat matching my own." Jackson grunted. "Come on, big guy. Don't you die on a Saturday. I hate doing paperwork on Saturdays." With a wet, gasping sound, my navigator jolted back to life. Jackson didn't celebrate. He just moved to the next body dot suddenly. A massive groan shook both ships. A proximity alarm blared. The anomaly was winning. We were being pulled into the event horizon. "Miller!" The pilot's voice screamed over the coms from the Nightingale. "The gravity well is peaking. If we don't jump in 10 seconds, we're all atoms." Miller looked at me, then at the two scientists still unconscious in the corner. Logic dictated he should leave them and save the ones already awake. The Council's efficiency protocol demanded it. Instead, Miller grabbed both unconscious aliens, one under each arm, like they weighed nothing. "Jackson, Sarah. Grab the commander. We're out of time." They hauled us through the umbilical tether just as the metal began to twist. I saw the Starseeker, my home for 10 years, crumple like a piece of paper as we cleared the airlock. The Nightingale's engines roared, with a sound that felt like the universe was tearing in half. There was a blinding flash of light, a sickening jolt of hyperacceleration, and then silence. The gravity was gone. The screaming alarms stopped. I lay on the floor of the human ship, gasping in the warm, recycled air. Miller pulled off his helmet, revealing a sweaty, exhausted face with a wide, ridiculous grin. He offered me a plastic cup of lukewarm water. "Calculation update, Commander," Miller said, checking a tablet. "Survival rate, 100%. Tell the Council their math sucks." I looked at my crew, all of them alive, being tended to by humans who were already joking about what they wanted for dinner. I realized then that the galaxy wasn't cold because of physics. It was cold because it lacked the heat of human stubbornness. They didn't save us because it was logical. They saved us because they refused to let the numbers tell them what to do. 3 hours had passed since the Nightingale snatched us from the mouth of the anomaly. We were now sitting in what the humans called the mess hall. It was a cramped, noisy room that smelled of burnt caffeine and something they called bacon. I sat at a bolted-down metal table, watching my crew. They were wrapped in thick, fuzzy human blankets, their many eyes wide with shock. Not because they had almost died, they were used to the dangers of space, but because of the human named Sarah. She was currently scolding a 3-meter-tall Xylosian warrior for trying to stand up too fast. "Sit down, Big Blue," Sarah snapped, pushing him back into his seat with one hand while holding a tray of food in the other. "Your blood pressure is lower than a basement. You eat the soup, or I tie you to the bed. Clear?" The warrior, who had once wrestled a desert hydra to death, nodded meekly and took the spoon. "Commander," a voice said. Miller slid into the seat across from me. He had changed into a stained gray jumpsuit. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. "Just got a ping from your council. They want to know where to pick up the remains of the Starseeker." I felt a cold bitterness in my chest. They didn't expect to find remains. They expected a data log and a memorial service. Miller leaned back, sipping from a chipped mug. "Yeah, well, we sent them a photo of your navigator eating a grilled cheese sandwich. Their AI responded with a logic error. I think we broke their brain." "Why did you do it, Miller?" I asked, the question finally bursting out. "The fuel you spent, the damage to your hull. The cost of this rescue is 10 times the value of my crew's lives. By every galactic standard, you have made a terrible investment." Miller stopped smiling. He looked at the mug in his hands, his expression softening. "My great-grandfather was a firefighter back on Earth," he said quietly. "In a place called California." He used to tell me that when a house is burning, you don't look at the real estate value before you run inside. You listen for the heartbeat. He looked up at me. "The galaxy thinks of life as a resource, like fuel or ore. But humans? We think of life as a debt. We're all alive because someone else took a chance on us once. We're just paying it forward." Suddenly, the ship's comms crackled. It was the same cold, synthetic voice from the Galactic Council. "Nightingale, this is Council Dispatch 7. We have received your status report. We find your actions inefficient. You have risked a Class 4 medical frigate for a 0% probability event. Please explain the tactical advantage of this maneuver." Miller sighed, reached over to the console, and pressed the talk button. "Dispatch 7, this is Miller. The tactical advantage is that we're the only ones in this sector with a 100% success rate today. Also, we're keeping the Xylosians. They're much better at cards than you guys. Nightingale out." He clicked the radio off and looked at me with a wink. "You know, Commander, your people are pretty good at math. Maybe you can help us figure out how to fix our thrusters. We kind of melted them back there." I looked at the soup-covered warrior, my recovering navigator, and the chaotic, warm, beautiful mess of the human ship. I stood up and offered my hand, a gesture I had seen Miller use. "I think," I said, "that I am finished with the Council's math. Show me your engines, Miller. Let's see if we can make them do something else impossible." The Nightingale's engine room was not a place of science. It was a place of industrial worship. Steam hissed from bypass valves, and the air hummed with a vibration so deep I could feel it in my primary and secondary hearts. "There's the problem," Miller said, pointing a grease-stained finger at a glowing conduit. "The heat sinks reached 10,000 degrees when we pulled you out. The coolant crystallized. In about an hour, the engine is going to turn into a very expensive campfire." I looked at the readings. My Xylosian mind immediately began to calculate. "Miller, this is impossible to fix without a dry dock," I said, my voice trembling. "The thermal pressure is too high. If you open that valve to flush the crystals, the back pressure will incinerate anyone within 20 meters. "Yup," Miller said, popping the P. He was rummaging through a toolbox. "That's why I'm going in with a manual pressure hose. I just need someone to hold the override switch on the other side of the bulkhead." "You will die," I stated. It wasn't a guess. It was a mathematical certainty. Even in your heavy suit, the heat transfer will cook you in seconds. Miller stopped. He pulled a small, crumpled photograph from his pocket and taped it to the control panel. It showed a woman and a small human child sitting on green grass. "The Council sent a message 10 minutes ago," Miller said, his back to me. "They're refusing to send a tow ship. They said that since the Nightingale is now damaged beyond logical repair, we are officially classified as debris. They've closed the sector." I felt a surge of rage that nearly blinded me. "They abandoned you. After you saved us, they abandoned you." "Standard math, Commander," Miller shrugged, pulling on his heavy gloves. "One broken med frigate plus 34 aliens equals a net loss. They're just balancing the books." He walked toward the airlock of the reactor core. "Wait!" I shouted. "I have a calculation." "A new one," Miller paused. "The Xylosian Starseeker used cold plasma stabilizers," I said, my fingers flying over the human keyboard, translating my language into theirs. "We have 3 of them in our emergency pods, the pods you hauled into your cargo bay. If we bypass the human coolant loop and inject the cold plasma directly into your core, it'll either freeze the engine solid or blow us to the Andromeda Galaxy," Miller finished, a grin spreading across his face. "I like those odds. It's not an odd, Miller. It's a 42% chance of success." 42%? Miller laughed, slamming the airlock shut. "Commander, in human terms, that's practically a sure thing. Let's get to work. For the next 40 minutes, we didn't work like two different species. We worked like a single organism. My crew, still weak and shaking, lined up to haul the heavy plasma stabilizers from the cargo bay. Humans and Xylosians stood shoulder to shoulder, passing tools, shouting warnings, and ignoring the heat. Injecting plasma in 3, 2, 1. I screamed. The ship bucked. A sound like a dying god echoed through the hulls. The temperature gauges redlined, vibrated, and then suddenly dropped. The angry red lights on the bridge turned a cool, steady blue. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of 30 humans and 30 aliens all exhaling at the same time. We are alive, my navigator whispered, looking at the screens. Not just alive, Miller said, walking out of the reactor room, drenched in sweat but standing tall. We've got engine power. And since the Council thinks we're debris, they aren't watching the long-range sensors. He looked at me, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Commander, how do you feel about a little unauthorized navigation? I know a pirate moon where they don't care about Council math, but they do care about a ship full of the best engineers and medics in the quadrant. I looked at my crew. For the first time in our history, we weren't looking for orders from the Empire. We were looking at the humans. Mathematics tells me that staying with you is a risk to our careers, our standing, and our safety, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. And? Miller asked. And, I replied, I've decided I'm very bad at math. Set a course, Captain Miller. We're not done being a nuisance yet. The Nightingale was no longer a ship of mercy. With the Council's cold plasma stabilizers humming in its belly and a crew of Xylosian engineers working the consoles, it had become a ghost. We were flying with our transponders off, cutting through the dead zones of the galaxy where the Council's sensors couldn't reach. But the Council wasn't done with us. Commander, we have a problem, my navigator said, his voice trembling. He was now wearing a human-style headset over his crest. A Council peacekeeper vessel is shadowing our wake. It's the Axiom, a heavy cruiser. Miller, who was busy teaching a Xylosian how to play a human game called poker, stood up instantly. The relaxed atmosphere in the mess hall evaporated. The Axiom? Miller spat the name like it was poison. That's not a rescue ship. That's an eraser ship. They aren't here to talk. They are hailing us, the navigator reported. Put them through, Miller ordered, stepping onto the bridge. The screen flickered to life. A high architect of the Council appeared. He looked like a creature made of glass and geometry, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of spirit. Nightingale, the architect spoke, his voice a series of tonal clicks translated into English. You are in possession of Xylosian assets that have been officially declared deceased. By continuing to operate a debris-class vessel, you are violating Galactic Sanctity Code 9. Power down your engines and prepare for reclamation. Reclamation? Miller growled. That's a fancy word for scrap metal. These people aren't assets, architect. They're my crew. Logic dictates that a dead crew cannot be a crew, the architect replied. The Xylosian Empire has already collected the insurance credits for their loss. To allow them to return would create a financial paradox. You are an anomaly, Miller. And anomalies must be erased. The screen went black. They're charging their main batteries, the navigator shouted. Impact in 30 seconds. Vorax! Miller turned to me, his face grim. Your plasma stabilizers. Can they do more than just cool the engine? I understood his thought immediately. It was a human thought, reckless, dangerous, and mathematically offensive. If we reverse the polarity and vent the cold plasma through the rear exhaust ports, I said, my fingers flying over the console, it will create a localized absolute zero cloud. It will freeze anything that touches it instantly, but it will also burn out our stabilizers forever. We will be stranded again. Better stranded than erased, Miller said. Do it, the Axiom fired. A beam of pure thermal energy streaked through the void, aimed directly at our core. Venting, now. I screamed. The Nightingale shuddered as a massive cloud of shimmering blue-white mist erupted from our stern. The Council's thermal beam hit the cloud, and instead of melting us, the beam itself froze. The energy was trapped in a crystalline lattice. Shattering into harmless light, the Axiom, moving too fast to pivot, sailed straight into the mist. On our monitors, we watched as the mighty cruiser, the pride of the Council's fleet, turned into a giant ice sculpture. Its engines choked, its sensors frosted over, and it began to drift aimlessly, a silent monument to its own cold logic. Calculations, Navigator? Miller asked, leaning against the command chair. The Axiom is incapacitated for at least 12 hours, the Navigator reported, a hint of pride in his voice. Survival probability, 99%. Wait, I said, looking at the sensor readings. There is one more thing. The Axiom's communications array is still open. They were broadcasting our destruction to the entire Council network. Miller grinned. So the whole galaxy just saw a debris-class medical ship freeze a heavy cruiser? Yes, I replied. And they saw that we are very much alive. Miller looked out at the stars. Well then, I guess we've officially graduated from being a nuisance to being a revolution. Varax, tell your boys to get the tea ready. I think we're going to have a lot of dead ships looking for a place to hide soon. I looked at the blue-tinted engine room, then at the frozen giant behind us. The Council's math was perfect, but it had one fatal flaw. It forgot that a 0, when placed next to a 1, can change everything. Course set for the pirate moon, Captain, I said. Let's go see how many more anomalies we can find. The pirate moon was not a moon at all. It was an ancient, hollowed-out Dyson shell fragment, hidden inside a nebula of ionized gas. To the Council, it was a hazardous navigation zone. To the outcasts of the galaxy, it was free haven. As the Nightingale limped into the docking bay, I expected to see criminals, thieves, and scavengers. Instead, I saw a graveyard of impossible survivors. There were ships from a dozen different species vessels that had been officially logged as lost by the Council over the last century. There were battered freighter crews who had refused to dump their cargo during solar flares, and science vessels that had stayed behind to evacuate primitive colonies. Every single one of them had a human ship nearby, tethered like a guardian. Welcome to the error log. Commander, Miller said as the docking clamps hissed shut. This is where all the zeros come to live. We stepped off the ramp, and for the first time in my life, I saw something the Council said didn't exist. Interspecies cooperation without a contract. Human mechanic was sharing a welding torch with a multi-limbed insectoid from the Varzal system. A group of avian pilots were trading navigation charts with a Xylosian elder. There were no credits being exchanged. No logic cores were calculating the value of the help. Miller, a tall woman with a bionic arm and a captain's jacket, walked toward us. I saw the feed from the Axiom. Nice move with the plasma vent. You've officially made us the most wanted ghosts in the quadrant. Commander Varax, meet Captain Sarah Chun of the St. Jude, Miller introduced us. She's the one who started this mess 10 years ago. I didn't start it. Chun laughed, her eyes turning to me. I just refused to leave a crippled luxury liner full of orphans because the window of efficiency had closed. I was a junior officer then. The Council stripped my rank and left us for dead. 10 years later. Well, look around. I looked at the massive cavern. There were thousands of people here. The Council is coming, isn't it? I asked. They cannot allow this place to exist. If the galaxy finds out that 0% survival is a lie, their entire system of control through fear and logic will crumble. They're already on their way, Chun said, her face hardening. The Axiom was just the scout. They're sending a Sanctity fleet. They're going to format this moon. A heavy silence fell over the group. My Xylosian mind began to race. A Sanctity fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and a world cracker. The math was simple. We had no chance. We have to flee, I said. Scatter into the nebula. No, Miller said, his voice quiet but like iron. We've spent 100 years running and hiding in the shadows. We've let them tell us who is valuable and who is debris for too long. He looked at the gathered crowd, the broken, the lost, the rescued, and the rescuers. Humans have another saying. Varax, Miller said, looking at me. It's not as nice as the no one gets left behind one. What is it? I asked. Miller leaned in, a dark, defiant spark in his eyes. If you're going through hell, keep going. We aren't running anymore, Captain Chun added, signaling to the mechanics. We're turning the Nightingale and every ship in this bay into something the Council's math can't comprehend. We're going to weaponize our errors. I looked at my Xylosian crew. They weren't afraid anymore. They were looking at the humans, learning that look of stubborn, beautiful defiance. Navigator, I called out to my second in command. Gather the Xylosian engineers. We are going to teach these humans how to overclock a warp core until it screams. If the Council wants to treat us like an anomaly, then let's be the biggest anomaly they've ever seen, the Navigator finished. A toothy grin appearing on his face. For the first time in history, the logically dead were preparing for war. And I realized with a shiver of excitement that the Council's math was about to face a variable it never accounted for: spite. The nebula outside the error log didn't glow with the beauty of stars. It hummed with the static of a death sentence. On our long-range sensors, 12 white pips appeared. The Council's Sanctity fleet. They moved in perfect, geometric synchronization, a cold machine coming to delete a typo in their reality. They've entered the outer rim, my navigator reported. His voice was steady, filtered through a human-made headset. They aren't even hailing us this time. They've slaved all their main cannons to a single AI core. They're going to fire simultaneously. In any other battle, this would be the end. 12 heavy cruisers versus a collection of battered medical ships and dead freighters. Varax, you ready? Miller's voice came over the internal comms. He wasn't on the bridge. He was in the cargo bay, standing next to something the humans had spent the last 48 hours building. The Xylosian ghost signal is primed, I replied, my hands dancing over a console that was now a chaotic hybrid of crystal tech and copper wiring. But Miller, if this fails, we aren't just debris. We are atoms. I've been atoms before, Varax. It's overrated, Miller joked, though I could hear the heavy breathing behind his mask. Execute the bait and switch. The Council fleet reached firing range. Their ships glowed with an eerie white light as they prepared to format the moon. Fire, the Council AI commanded. The sound wasn't heard, but the vibration shook the very fabric of space. 12 beams of absolute destruction streaked toward the pirate moon. But they didn't hit. US.10 kilometers in front of the moon, the space rippled. The beams hit a shimmering curtain of ghost signals, thousands of tiny, cheap human drones we had outfitted with Xylosian cloaking emitters. To the Council's perfect AI, every single drone looked like a heavy cruiser. The Council AI suffered a logic spike. It had fired at 12 targets, but its sensors suddenly reported 14,000 targets. Their targeting computers are looping. I shouted. They're trying to calculate which one is the real moon. Our turn, Miller barked. All ships, burn your engines. Give 'em the human welcome. The error log didn't just stay still. The moon itself, which was a Dyson fragment, had been fitted with the Nightingale's salvaged thrusters and the Xylosian warp stabilizers. The entire moon shifted, accelerating toward the Council fleet like a massive, jagged bullet, but the real attack wasn't the moon. It was the debris. From the shadows of the nebula, hundreds of ships the Council thought were scrap emerged. They weren't firing lasers. They were firing tethers. What are they doing? My navigator asked in shock. They're pack bonding, I whispered, recognizing the human tactic. The human ships didn't try to outshoot the cruisers. They flew directly at them, slamming magnetic harpoons into their hulls and dragging them toward each other. The St. Jude led the charge, grappling two heavy cruisers and forcing their shields to overlap in short-circuit. It was a barroom brawl in deep space. Nightingale to all ghosts. Miller's voice echoed across every frequency. They think you're numbers. Show them your heartbeats. Break their formations. I watched as a tiny human tugboat, a ship that should have been recycled 50 years ago, latched onto the Council's flagship. It didn't fire a weapon. It simply dumped 10 tons of redneck-engineered magnetic sludge into the flagship's radiator fans. The flagship's engines began to choke. The perfect formation shattered. For the first time in history, the Council was afraid. They were facing an enemy that didn't care about self-preservation math. "Commander!" the navigator yelled. "The world cracker! It's moving behind the cruisers. It's targeting the moon's core." The world cracker was a massive needle-like ship designed to pierce a planet's crust. If it fired, the error log would shatter and everyone on it would die. Miller's voice went quiet on the comms. "Varax, I need you to take the bridge. I'm taking the Nightingale in." "Miller, no." I stood up. "The Nightingale is a medical ship. It has no armor. It has a warp core fueled by Xylosian plasma," Miller said. I could hear him walking toward the pilot's seat. "And it has a 42% chance of making a very loud noise. That's a sure thing, remember? You cannot do this." "The math. Forget the math, Virax," Miller interrupted, and I could swear I heard him smiling. "Tell Sarah and the kid. Tell them I was never late for dinner. I just took the long way home." The Nightingale detached from the moon. It didn't look like a hero's ship. It was dented, leaking coolant, and painted a dull, dirty white. But as it accelerated toward the world cracker, it looked like the brightest star in the galaxy. "Miller!" I screamed, but the comms went to static. The Nightingale didn't fire. It simply entered a suicide warp directly into the world cracker's firing chamber. There was no sound. Only a white-hot expansion of light that turned the night into day. The world cracker didn't just explode. It vanished into a rift of its own making. I sat in the silence of the bridge, staring at the empty spot on the sensor where the Nightingale had been. Around us, the remaining Council cruisers, their god ship destroyed, turned and fled into the dark. The battle was over. The Zeros had one dot, but as I looked at the photograph Miller had, left on the console, the woman and the child on the mire, green grass, I realized that the cost of 100% survival was sometimes the person who taught you how to live. The nebula was quiet. The Council's geometric fleet had scattered like glass shards in a storm. On the bridge of the error log, my crew was silent. Xylosians do not cry, our biology doesn't allow for it. But the way my navigator lowered his head, his crest drooping in the dim light, spoke more than any sound could. "Scan for life signs," I whispered. My voice felt hollow, like an empty hull. "Commander." "There is nothing," the navigator replied. The warp core detonation was absolute. The world cracker and the Nightingale they are gone. I looked at the screen. Where Miller's ship had been, there was only a shimmering cloud of ionized plasma. The 42% chance had failed. The math had finally caught up to the man who ignored it. "Wait!" a voice crackled over the emergency channel. It was Captain Sarah Chun from the St. Jude. Her voice was thick with emotion. "Commander, look at the sensor's sub-frequency. Below the radiation spike." I adjusted the filters. My heart skipped a beat. Inside the cloud of the explosion, there was a tiny localized distortion. It wasn't a ship. It was an escape pod, but it wasn't moving. It was caught in the gravitational eddy of the rift the world cracker had opened before it collapsed. It was being pulled into the in-between, a place where no ship could go and survive. He's in the rift, I realized. The pod's thrusters aren't strong enough to fight the collapse. We can't get to him, Chun said, her voice breaking. If any of our ships get that close, the rift will swallow us too. The gravity is exponential. Mathematics says he's, don't you dare say it, I barked, standing up so fast my chair hit the floor. Don't you dare give me a percentage. I turned to my crew. They looked at me, confused. Navigator, what is the human way to solve a gravity problem? The navigator blinked his many eyes. Usually, they hit it with something heavy, or they use a rope. A rope, I repeated. I looked at the 3 heavy cruisers the St. Jude had grappled earlier. They were still tethered by magnetic harpoons, drifting and powerless. Captain Chun, are your magnetic tethers still attached to those council cruisers? Yes, but they're dead weight, she replied. No, I said, a wild human-like plan forming in my mind. They are anchors. If we link all the ships in this bay together, human, Xylosian, and council scrap, we can create a chain. A lifeline that stretches into the rift. Varax, that's suicide, Chun whispered. The tension will snap every ship in the line. Then we don't use the ships as the line, I countered. We use the warp fields. If we daisy chain our stabilizers, we can create a tunnel of stable space. We can reach him. It was the most illogical, dangerous, and resource-heavy plan in the history of space travel. It required every ship to give up its own safety to save a single pod. Do it, Chun said after a pause. All ships. Tether up. It was a sight that would have made the Galactic Council's AI crash. Hundreds of ships, battered freighters, tugs, and cruisers formed a literal chain in the void. They latched onto each other, hull to hull, wing to wing. At the very front of the chain, the St. Jude fired its main harpoon, aimed directly at the drifting pod. The harpoon missed. The gravity of the rift was too strong, bending the metal cable. Again. I shouted. The second harpoon fired. It grazed the pod but couldn't lock. The rift was closing. Miller's pod was inches away from vanishing dot suddenly. A tiny ship, a Xylosian scout, broke formation. It didn't have a harpoon. It had a docking port. It flew into the danger zone, the pilot screaming as his hull began to glow from the friction of the closing rift. The scout slammed into the pod, nudging it just a few meters close enough for the St. Jude's third harpoon to bite. Got him! Chun yelled, PUL. Everyone pull. Hundreds of engines roared in unison. The chain of ships groaned. Metal screamed as the tension transferred from one hull to the next. The St. Jude's engine started to smoke. My navigator joined in, slaving the error log's massive thrusters to the chain. Slowly, impossibly. The tiny pod was dragged out of the white-hot mouth of the rift. Just as the pod cleared the event horizon, the rift snapped shut with a force that sent a shockwave through the entire sector. The chain broke. Ships tumbled. But the pod was safe. We waited. The medical team from the St. Jude reached the pod first. The silence on the comms was agonizing. I found myself holding the photograph Miller had left behind, my fingers trembling. Then, a cough. A long, painful, very human cough. Is the tea ready yet? Miller's voice was weak, rasping, and beautiful. Because that was a really long way home. The error log erupted in cheers. Xylosians were banging on consoles, humans were hugging each other, and for one brief moment, the entire galaxy felt warm. Miller was alive. The zero had been beaten again. I sat back in my chair, looking at the stars. I realized then that the Council was right about one thing. We were an anomaly. We were a mistake in their perfect, cold universe. And as I watched the ships begin to regroup, I knew that this mistake was the only thing worth fighting for. "Commander," the navigator said, smiling, "what is our next move?" I looked at the photograph of the green grass and the child. "Tell the crew to prepare for long-range travel," I said. "We're going to find that place with the green grass. I think it's time the logically dead went home." The era log was no longer a hidden moon. It was a beacon. For months, the story of the Nightingale and the frozen axiom had spread through the stars like a virus. It wasn't just a story of a battle, it was a story of a choice. Everywhere across the galaxy, crews were looking at their efficiency protocols, and then looking at each other. The math was breaking, but for us, the war was over. We were traveling through the silent black corridors toward a coordinate that didn't exist on any Council map. "We're crossing the Sol threshold," Miller's voice called out from the pilot's seat. He was still wrapped in medical bandages, his arm in a sling, but his hand was steady on the controls. "Varax, come take a look. You've seen 1,000 worlds, but you've never seen a cradle." I stepped up to the view screen. The nebula cleared, and there it was. A small sapphire blue marble hanging in the velvet dark. It didn't have the massive orbital rings of the Xylosian homeworld, or the sterile metallic shells of the Council hubs. It looked fragile. "Earth," I whispered. "The Council quarantined this sector 80 years ago," Miller said, his voice soft. "They told the galaxy we were a biological hazard. The truth was, they were just scared. They knew if the rest of you saw how we lived, you'd stop being good little calculators." As we descended through the atmosphere, my sensors began to go haywire. There were no logistics drones or resource management towers. Instead, I saw vast stretches of that impossible color Miller had talked about. Green dot, we landed in a valley surrounded by ancient, jagged mountains. The air that rushed into the ship when the ramp lowered wasn't recycled or filtered. It was sweet, smelling of rain and growth. A small group was waiting for us. At the front stood a woman and a young child. They didn't move with the rigid precision of the Council. They ran. They ran toward Miller, who stumbled down the ramp and collapsed into their arms. I stood at the top of the ramp, watching the pack-bonding ritual in its purest form. There were no words, only the sounds of relief that defied any linguistic translation. "Commander," the navigator said, standing beside me. He was holding his data slate, but he wasn't looking at it. "I have just run a final scan of our status. And," I asked, "our careers are destroyed. Our citizenship is revoked. We have 0 credits, no standing in the Empire, and our ship is held together by duct tape and prayer." He paused, looking at a human child laughing as she tried to climb Miller's leg. "Mathematically, we have lost everything." I looked at the sun setting over the Terran horizon, painting the sky in colors I didn't know existed. I felt the warmth on my scales, real warmth, not the artificial heat of a reactor. "You're wrong, Navigator," I said. "For the first time in our lives, the math is finally balanced." I stepped off the ramp and onto the grass. It felt soft beneath my feet. Across the galaxy, the Galactic Council would continue to calculate. They would build faster ships and colder A-is. They would try to erase the error log from history. But they had already lost. Because once you teach a soul that a 0% chance is just a suggestion, you cannot make them afraid of the dark again. I looked at Miller, who was now sitting on the grass, pointing up at the Nightingale and telling a story to his child. He looked up and caught my eye, giving me that sharp, defiant human wink. "The Council calculated we would die in the void. The Council calculated we were debris. The Council calculated we didn't exist. The humans ignored them. And so did we."